Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. This week, the IDF announced that the 162nd Division was going back into northern Gaza for an operation that it said was aimed at denying Hamas the ability to reconstitute itself. This was an area in Gaza where Israel had operated already months ago. It had cleared the place of Hamas fighters and infrastructure, tunnels, weapons. But then what happened was when it pulled out and moved to other parts of Gaza, Hamas came back. Why? Because while it has been significantly degraded, weakened, and broken, Hamas still is there. And as long as there is a vacuum, it will come back. There's one military officer who understands this challenge. It's General David Petraeus. General Petraeus, a former CIA director, previously led a surge of U.S. troops and shifted Iraqi militia alliances to help turn the tide of the Iraq war. He spoke with my JPPI colleague Noah Slepkov about the lessons he learned fighting counterinsurgency in Iraq and how they can be applied to Gaza. It's a strategy that he refers to as not just clearing an area and moving on, but rather clear, hold, and build. Have a listen.
General Petraeus, thanks so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Noah. Thank you.
Looking back now, what do you believe Hamas's military objectives were with the October 7th attack? And do you believe it achieved those objectives?
I don't believe it achieved the objectives, which I think were really to dramatically change the situation in the region relative to Israel. In particular, to do enormous damage to Israel, to get Iran's other proxies and perhaps Iran itself very directly engaged against Israel in much more substantial ways than they have been, as problematic as Hezbollah's participation has been. And to bring the issue of the Palestinians to the fore in a way that it was not on 10/7. And perhaps also to interfere with the possibility of an extension of the Abraham Accord to that with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, that has been delayed clearly, but it's by no means even on life support. I think that's still a very real prospect, although it clearly will depend a great deal on what Israel does to demonstrate the commitment to living side by side with the Palestinian people in peace and harmony and so forth, noting that it takes two sides to do that. But that prospect is still there. And in the meantime, of course, what has happened is Hamas itself has been dramatically degraded, not destroyed, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I think it's still somewhat incomplete. Hezbollah has been decimated when it comes to its senior ranks and also to its command, control, and communication system, but still a very formidable force. Just unable to do what was feared most, which was to launch a very substantial simultaneous attack with the tens of thousands, still probably has over 130,000 missiles, rockets, drones, and so forth, that could overwhelm the sophisticated and very impressive Israeli layered air and ballistic missile defense. And probably is about to do some significant damage to Iran's military infrastructure as well. So whatever it was that Yahya Sinwar hoped for, I certainly don't think that he has achieved it, other than, again, to delay the possible agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is by no means impossible. But here, if I could, I think, again, going forward depends a great deal, especially when it comes to Hamas, on whether Israel provides a vision of the future for the Palestinian people in Gaza. Understanding the extraordinary trauma that Israel experienced on 10/7, which was the worst day in Israeli history, I think it's fair to say. The equivalent of that, by the way, for the U.S., keeping in mind that we lost not quite 3,000 individuals in the 9/11 attacks, the equivalent would be the loss of 40,000 and 7,000 taken hostage. So to give some perspective, because I think for those who have not been in Israel, who have not talked to the people and the leaders, it's hard to imagine how traumatic this day, this event was, and why immediately the objective had to be the destruction of Hamas, ensuring that it never governs again, while also trying to get the hostages back. So Hamas has been dramatically degraded, and Israel's taken control of the Philadelphia corridor, the southern border between Gaza and the Sinai, Egypt, and has denied the availability of the tunnels that used to run underneath that area for rearming of Hamas, more ammunition, weapons systems, material for making rockets and missiles and so forth. And that is very, very significant. But the job is still not complete, because if the intent is to prevent Hamas from having influence in the territory, then clearly what has to be done is there has to be security achieved, established, and only Israel can do that, I'm afraid. And then sequentially, starting in the north, probably moving south a wall every mile or so, and then a couple of north-south walls, you create gated communities. This is what we did during the surge in Iraq, when we changed our strategy from essentially what Israel is doing, which is clear and leave. You go into a neighborhood, you clear it of enemy, you destroy their infrastructure, but then you leave, and inevitably, of course, it's a vacuum, and it's filled by bad guys once again. And while Hamas has nowhere near the capability that they had at the outset, it's not a coherent terrorist organization anymore at all, but there's still an awful lot of remnants, and they do continue to recruit and build Hamas 2.0, albeit without the availability of the kinds of capabilities that were provided to them before through the tunnels, and in some cases through the crossings. And of course, Rafah crossing between Gaza and the Sinai is also under Israeli control and should remain that way, by the way. I don't see any scenario in which Israel should give that up until there is absolute confidence in a security force that has been established in Gaza that does not have Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or other extremists as part of it. That has to take place. And again, only if you do that can you improve the lives of the Palestinian people, who right now are in a pretty catastrophic humanitarian situation. 60% of the structures have been largely destroyed. You can only imagine the challenges with hygiene, the uncertainties about food and water, school, clinics, all the rest of this. And so only if you establish security can you introduce humanitarian assistance in an organized way without it being hijacked by criminal elements or Hamas remnants. Only if you do that can you begin the restoration of basic services, reconstruction of damaged infrastructure, repair of schools, clinics, markets, roads, etc., and get people back into homes of some type. And you have biometric ID cards, and of course Israel's skill with biometric is legendary, and they'll identify the bad guys in this process if they actually try to stick around in an area that Israel is clearing and then holding. And if you do this, of course, then you can also introduce Palestinian security forces that probably trained and equipped by the Americans at the Jordanian International Police Training Center, can be supervised by Israel. Arab forces will come in. They're not going to come in if there's not security. They're not going to fight fellow Arabs for Israel, nor are Palestinians from the West Bank going to fight Hamas or Israel. But if you have security and you can sustain it, and this is the way to do that, then I think you can take all these other actions that are so critical to providing a better life for the Palestinians. And over time, as you complete all this, and by the way, you're going to get Yahya Sinwar during this, and the other probably 10,000 or more still Islamist extremist terrorists who are largely irreconcilable, then you can have a better future, and perhaps you can actually demonstrate to the entire world that Palestinians and Israeli Jews can live side by side in harmony. And then Saudi Arabia comes back to the table and said, well, if you can do that there, why can't we do it in the West Bank? Figure out the modus operandi there, noting, I mean, this is the most intransigent issue out there, but even intractable issues sometimes can be resolved. And it would start there. By the way, then once you sort that out, why would Hezbollah keep launching rockets into Israel, which is going to be difficult to stop completely? You can take control of the area up to the Litani River, but that's hard. And you probably don't want to keep occupying it, even though the peacekeeping forces has been proven wholly incapable in enforcing the Security Council resolution of 2006, which ended that war and declared that Hezbollah should not be in that area. And they obviously have been, so they're violating that particular agreement. And that's what puts them in range with the more ubiquitous rockets and even anti-tank guided missiles in an indirect fire mode against the villages in the north, displacing 65,000 poor Israelis who can't go home. So that is ongoing as well. And then we'll see what happens, of course, with the retaliation for the 180 ballistic missiles that Iran shot at Israel, the second attack from their own soil on Israel in recent months.
Well, thank you. That was a quite extensive answer. Let me try to pick some things apart. I remember being on a Zoom with you back in October, maybe 2-3 weeks after the war started, and you were talking about then exactly what you said. Now, don't make the mistakes we made in Iraq. Do a clear and hold strategy.
Yep.
And you've been saying this for the past year. And I remember thinking at the time, come on, we're not going to make that mistake. Surely this is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go into Gaza. We're going to clear out areas. We're going to rebuild those areas. Whoever wants to live in peace in those areas are going to be welcome to. Yet here we are, almost a year later from that conversation, a year since October 7th, and the government of Israel has not adopted a clear and hold strategy. And I know you've spoken with various people from the government of Israel. What is your sense as to why they're not adopting this strategy?
I think there's several reasons. And I have spoken to very senior individuals in the Minister of Defense, the most senior, in fact, the top three. And again, I think they're all, by the way, they're all former distinguished retired two-stars. I think they get it. I think there are political difficulties, without question, as have been well recognized, I think, publicly. The trauma that Israelis sustained has led them, I think, to find it difficult to differentiate between ordinary Palestinian citizens in Gaza and Hamas. This is why I highlighted how traumatic that experience was and continues to be, with over 100 hostages still in Hamas's hands. Then, Israel doesn't have a counterinsurgency field manual. We didn't have one until 2006. Between my 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq, we wrote it and then overhauled every aspect of the preparation of our forces. Israel doesn't have a huge force the way we had. We ultimately had 165,000 American men and women alone, tens of thousands of coalition, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis with whom we could work to do this clear, hold, and build approach. That was the difference in the surge versus the previous year when the Sunni Shia civil war intensified so terrifyingly, frankly. And this is hard. This is tough. We did 77 additional locations just for our forces in the greater Baghdad area to live with the people, which is the only way that you can secure them, and creating over time innumerable of these gated communities in the difficult locations so we could keep Al-Qaeda, Sunni insurgents, Shia militia supported by Iran out of those neighborhoods and accomplish what we did accomplish. And then, by the way, then the people start supporting you. They start giving you intelligence. Now, very different, much more challenging in Gaza, the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians there, without question. Diabolically more challenging context, 350, 400 miles of big tunnel underground, almost a highway that runs from north to south with all the branches off it, huge industrial complexes underground, all of this. But again, this is the only way I see going forward that is viable. And again, keep in mind, it took us years to figure this out. And again, we had very large forces. Israel does not have that either. As you well know, it's a modest sized force, and you have to call up reserves constantly, as is the case right now. with, I guess it's the better part of 3 divisions just for the area of very southern Lebanon, Litani, to the northern border of Israel. But again, the problem is I see no alternative. I've written about this. We did a piece, I think it was in Foreign Affairs, with a couple of the others with whom we shared the surge in Iraq experience that were back in Washington, and very supportive. One was the war czar in the White House, Megan O'Sullivan. And so again, I think it's sort of inescapable, it's unavoidable, except that it is really, really hard. And right now, for example, the focus is very much on Hezbollah. I don't think you could undertake this kind of approach right now. So right now, what it is continued raids whenever a threat is identified, go in and deal with it. But that is interminable. That's unending if you don't go in and establish security. There's a famous observation by an iconic figure in the Vietnam War, John Paul Vann, both as a military and then as a civilian, very senior civilian official on the ground, who said security may be 10% of the problem or 90% of the problem. Whatever it is, it's the first 10% or the first 90%. In other words, without it, nothing else is possible. And that was certainly the experience of the surge. We had all these grandiose development plans and reconciliation ideas and infrastructure initiatives, all of this stuff, local governance, you name it. But without security, that was irrelevant. Once you have security, that is what solidifies the foundation of security, because the people start to realize that their lives are better and that they should not allow the extremists who created such problems for them ever to be back in charge. Now, it'll be a longer period. Don't get me wrong. I recognize the differences between our relationship with the Sunni Arabs and the Shia Arabs in Iraq relative to the Israelis and the Palestinians in Gaza. But this is not impossible. And there's just really no alternative. That is the real issue here. And if you have an idea, or someone does, I'm all ears. I spent the better part of 8 of my last 11 years deployed or engaged in this kind of endeavor and learning from it as well. So even in the 15-month period where I wasn't, I had 6 consecutive commands as a general officer, 5 were in combat. One that was not was where we did the counterinsurgency field manual, overhauled all of the commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officer education programs, the training scenarios at the major training centers, every aspect of the road to war. And it distilled the lessons and then tried to institutionalize the lessons that we'd learned from the first few years in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, albeit a different kind of war, nowhere near as urban as Iraq was, which is what is more relevant, therefore, to the situation in Gaza.
It seems that perhaps the government of Israel is waiting for the United States or friendly Arab countries to volunteer to lead the whole phase of a strategy. Would you support American troops, boots on the ground, leading the rebuilding efforts in Gaza?
I think it's completely unrealistic. As I mentioned earlier, I've been out in the Gulf states twice in the last, 5 months. There is absolutely no willingness whatsoever to be the force that establishes security against fellow Arabs, even if they are Islamist extremists, that those Gulf states would like to see, frankly, destroyed and kept destroyed. They don't have obviously no love for extremists or political Islam, for that matter. It's one of their biggest fears. The Americans need to stay focused on our most important geographic region, while very much supporting with everything we can what's being done in the greater Middle East in support of Israel and in some cases the Gulf states, and the same with our Ukrainian partners who are fighting for their very existence, their war of independence. But they're happy. They want to fight for their country. Israel wants to fight for its country. I suspect the Israelis don't want Americans. I think it would probably be a big complication. They know what they need to do, I think. The problem is it's really hard to do, and there's therefore a delay in acknowledging that. Look, I believe I'm accurate in saying that Minister of Defense Gallant and also Benny Gantz, when he was still part of that wartime coalition, called for the prime minister to provide a political vision for Gaza. And again, I don't think there's any vision that can be achieved other than the way that I have laid this out. And it's kind of you to note that from the very beginning, several of us did in fact observe that this is what should be done, noting again, it's awfully hard if you've never done it before, if you don't have large forces, you don't have a field manual, you haven't trained for it. Which is why you do it the way I've described, which is sequentially. You take a bite-sized chunk at a time. You learn from each of these. Israelis are fantastic at identifying lessons and sharing them very, very rapidly and acting on them. You know, the iteration, especially when it comes to technology as well, is hugely impressive. So I think this is very doable, but very difficult, but also unavoidable. There just is no other alternative. And again, if your viewers identify it, please share it with me by all means.
Well, it's interesting because, in Israel, the far right are the ones who want to reoccupy Gaza. And what basically you're suggesting is a military occupation of Gaza until it's self-sustainable and which will take years. And we occupied Gaza from 1967 to 2004, to the pullout of 2004. I think one can argue quite unsuccessfully in the time that Israel was.
It also included though settlements,
right?
And there was no. In this case, what you do, you don't have settlements. What you have is a path to the future, and the way to get to the path to the future, which is Palestinians once again that are reasonable, governing Gaza, securing it, bringing it back to life with help from Arab countries, the US, other countries of the world concerned about the plot are in the territory. The only way to do that is, again, with Israel securing. But then what you do is you thin out pretty quickly, and you allow them to start taking responsibility. And the further down you go, of course, the more is being done behind you. And then you can have all kinds of other participants in this. You could really make this into a much, much better situation, not only than it is now, which is a pretty low bar, but perhaps you can get it into a better situation, certainly relative to the relationship with Israel, than it was before.
Right. You mentioned the counterinsurgency field manual, which you had a huge part of your life was.
There's never been a manual produced in less than a year in Army history. I think probably less than 3 years. And with the Chief of Staff of the Army's complete support, we cut through all the normal processes. I took one of my old West Point classmates with a PhD, persuaded him to leave the War College for a while and be the editor-in-chief. And then, frankly, I was probably the overarching editor-in-chief. I did as many as 30 drafts or edits of some of the really important chapters.
Wow. And you mentioned it in our conversation now about extremism and how it's not something that can be reconciled. So I just want to quote a section from the field manual, and so it says, quote, "Violent extremists resist changing their worldview. For them, coexistence or compromise is often unacceptable, especially when the movement is purist. The rigid worldview of such extremist groups means that friendly actions intended to create goodwill among the populace are unlikely to affect them. Similarly, if a group's ideology is so strong that it dominates all other issues, dialogue and negotiation will probably prove unproductive," unquote. If the majority of the Palestinian population in Gaza resolutely believe that their future depends solely on the elimination of the state of Israel and the establishment of a Palestinian state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and they see their future not in Gaza, but in liberated Haifa and Jaffa, what chance of success is there for implementing a clear and hold strategy? Do you believe?
Well, if that was the reality, I think you raise a very good point. I don't think it is the reality, actually. And in truth, what we established a couple of months into the surge, when I was committed reconciling with as many as we could, but not of the irreconcilables. we had an intelligence structure that did nothing but determine whether individuals were reconcilable or not. If they were irreconcilable, which I think the bulk of Hamas is, but by no means the bulk of the Palestinian population, there's two choices for them. They're either detained or if they resist detention, they're going to be killed. And that was our approach. But then we did also reconcile with over 103,000 of those that had been sort of tacitly accepting or modestly engaged or something like this, just because they're chameleons. You know, a lot of populations in situations like this, they do what they have to do to survive. And they often have chameleon-like attributes. And I think that is the case in Gaza, but you won't know unless you try it out. So again, I don't necessarily accept what you put out there. And I do think that it's necessary to test the proposition and to see if this can be done. If it can't be done, then there's a really serious problem here.
Right.
That's intractable.
Right.
I actually don't think that that is the case. A lot of people said Fallujah was intractable.
Right.
It wasn't. I walked through Fallujah with Katie Couric with a soft cap on 3 months after we completed the clearance of it, and the markets were back and everything else. So again, different situation. I know they'll all say terrible analogy, didn't have all the characteristics of this. Fair enough. Let's see how it works out, because there's nothing else right now that seems viable to me.
I mean, I hope you're right, of course. The only concern is that for 70 years, Western governments through the United Nations have been telling Palestinians, you are refugees of Israel. Someone who is born in Gaza today, 4 generations removed from 1948, they are told they are a refugee of Israel, that their birth location is Israel. They cannot go back there because the government there is hostile to them. So they are a refugee. If the Western governments accept that there's everyone in Gaza, or a huge portion of people in Gaza, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, are refugees from Palestine, and their homes are in Israel, how do we solve this conflict? Is it not time for Western governments, in this whole approach you're taking, to say to Palestinians, listen, you want to resolve the conflict? No problem. You can have a home in the West Bank or Gaza. That's where your future lies. You're not going to be coming back to Israel anytime soon. And when I say coming back, it's generous, because these are people, 1948 was 76, 77 years ago now. And if you had a house back then, you'd be 100 right now. So, the number of people who actually owned property in 1948 is probably a dozen, maybe.
Yes. But again, this also highlights something else that needs to be changed, and that is, in essence, the education system, if you will, the whole system of views about this very intractable issue, so that you can get to a point. Let's keep in mind that the offers at Camp David, then by Ehud Barak, and then Ehud Olmert in particular, were really quite substantial. I mean, Olmert took enormous political risk to make the compromises that were offered, and yet the leader of the Palestinian Authority rejected those in each case. You got to work through that. Again, I don't have the perfect prescription for all of that, but I can say that when it comes to Gaza, what I've laid out, I think, is the only possible alternative. And you won't know if it actually is possible, is proven to be the right approach, until you actually try it. And then when it comes to the West Bank, I think the big idea there has to be, okay, I got it. Neither political leader can make the compromises that were offered, and then on one side, and then not agreed on the other. I got that. But in the meantime, let's try to set conditions that, when you get to that moment, could actually enable a two-state solution, because again, there's no other alternative to that, even though I recognize that the public support for two-state solution in Israel has declined significantly. But in the absence of alternatives, let's try to figure out how to help build institutions, norms, education system, do away with pay for slay, all of these challenges that are obstacles to it. And on the other side as well, don't build more obstacles to something if you know that they could be challenges to that two-state solution. But noting that the current coalition that has Prime Minister Netanyahu in office obviously has to say that those are reservations about that would be a bit of an understatement.
All right, I want to move to some of the intelligence aspects of this. You have a very amazing career throughout the Army and then leading the CIA. So you're in a good position to help us walk through this. Why do you think it is that leading up to October 7th, the intelligence community in Israel did not fully understand what Hamas's intentions were? Clearly, they planned this attack, and this wasn't something that they just decided at the spur of the moment.
No, this was rehearsed.
Right. This was something.
What is particularly noteworthy is, of course, that the plans for the attack actually were captured, stolen. Low-level intelligence officers had them, and those above them believed that there's just no way that Hamas could carry this out. It was so diabolically clever, challenging, innovative, and there was a political predisposition to think that the strategy was working. Look, this was not just the worst intelligence failure in Israeli history, it was the worst military readiness failure and the worst political analytical failure, because there was an assessment at the very top that things with Gaza, with Hamas in charge, were going very well. Indeed, that's why there were additional of these worker visas being provided, which actually were being used in many cases to conduct reconnaissance on various Israeli command and control and centers, the nodes that were critical to all of this. Hamas obviously had superb operational security. They presumably understood how the Israelis could get insights into what it is that they were doing and planning and thinking, and they shifted to other means for communications and coordination. They injected into those streams misinformation, led the Israelis, lulled them to sleep a bit, and of course picked a perfect time to do it. It was a major religious holiday early in the morning. Some people dancing out in the desert are all sort of, out there as well, and carried this out. Look, this is barbaric. It was horrific. It was inhumane, inhuman, all of that. But the actual operation was very, very impressive. It blinded the Israelis right away. It cut off communications. It denied the use of the automatic machine guns, the sensors. The nodes were destroyed. It reflected a deep understanding of how Israel operated its intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and operations systems and command and control and communications, and then used earth-moving equipment, all of this, having rehearsed this right out in the open in previous months. But again, individuals at a certain level in the intelligence network never pushed it all the way up and just dismissed it. So again, this is a huge failure. Of course, there's also a focus on the West Bank. There was a reduction in the forces focused in the South. Again, the readiness that particular morning was at a particularly low level. A number were on vacation. The contingency plans weren't all that exercised. Took far too long for leaders to make decisions. I mean, it was individuals just taking action on their own in many cases that proved to be really very important in preventing even worse disaster than actually befell Israel on that day. So
you think?
Go ahead.
No, do you think it's one of these things that you on the face of it, well, why would Hamas do an all-out war with us? We'd beat them. They'd have to be crazy to start an all-out war. That it's just like, well, the same misconceptions of the Yom Kippur War and maybe even Pearl Harbor. That it would be such a disaster for them to start this war that they wouldn't do it because it's not in their best interest. Yet, like, when it's a creative
miscalculation repeatedly. In the book that I did with Andrew Roberts, there were the conflict wars started by the Arabs, basically. Actually, one where the Israelis preempted it, but again, in each case, they had these huge aspirations that they're going to defeat Israel, and of course, in each case, they were proven very, very wrong. Although there were some very touch and go moments, in the Golan, the Sinai, etc., as Israel regrouped. By the way, those were intelligence failures too, and also military readiness failures. But then regrouped, demonstrated incredible initiative in these different locations, then tremendous audacity and creativity, and all of a sudden you have the Third Army surrounded, and Henry Kissinger now has to make 3 phone calls repeatedly and can negotiate. By the way, you can't do that now. I mean, who do you call now to negotiate? There is not the directors, none of the leadership that you had at that particular time, where it could be resolved by a skilled, incredibly skilled, gifted diplomat like Henry Kissinger, who also, I would argue, is probably not on the scene at this moment.
Sure. Okay, as one of the world's experts on urban warfare, how do you determine when an army is acting morally or immorally? And how do you assess Israel's track record in Gaza?
That's a tough call, and I'm really reluctant to engage in this particular exercise because, first of all, I was second guessed on a number of occasions. I mean, what guided us were quite strict rules of engagement, weaponeering in considerable detail, and a general proposition. I had a sign on the wall facing me. Again, I had 5 combat commands as a general officer. In every one of those commands, you had a command post. Got bigger, obviously, as you get to 4 stars. And there's a sign on the wall that I will always put on there that's staring at me, along with all the other displays. And it asked a question: will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? If the answer to that is no, in other words, it's going to create, if the answer to that is that it will create more bad guys than it takes off the street, you're supposed to figure out how you change that. And if you can't, you're supposed to go sit under a tree until the thought passes, as they say. And so in this case, you have a very, very challenging context with all of the underground infrastructure that is so critical to Hamas and has to be destroyed. And the only way you can destroy it is with very substantial bombs, ultimately, that can penetrate the ground and so on. And unfortunately, a lot of these are underneath civilian infrastructure, some cases even hospitals and other structures that would normally be off limits. You got to be very, very careful with that. And again, without having looking at the weaponeering that was done, the assumptions that were made, the rules of engagement that were applied, I'm not going to make sweeping assessments of how Israel has done this. Clearly, there have been a lot of civilians killed, and yes, we're depending on the Gaza military or the Gaza medical folks, hardly unbiased. But again, I don't think it's at all unclear about the magnitude of the destruction and the loss of innocent civilian life, women and children in particular. They're not generally members of Hamas, obviously. So. And again, there are some that, you look and, there are certainly questions in the back of your mind. But I'm not going to make a general assessment of this without having had the opportunity to really sit down and have the kind of information that I had when I was making tough calls on these kinds of operations. Again, where you have a very important military objective, but there is the probability, not just the possibility, but the probability of loss of innocent life and damage to civilian infrastructure. but it's particularly acute in Gaza. I think I mentioned earlier, this is the most diabolically complex and challenging urban setting in history. I can't think of anything comparable to this because of that underground infrastructure that makes this so difficult and the extent of it. Yahya Sinwar, the hostages, and others are still undoubtedly in these labyrinthine tunnels that are so substantial. And that changes everything. The one thing we have not seen, and I fear we may see in the future, is suicide bombers, something that we had to contend with in a substantial number in the first 6-8 months of the surge, when there were about 110 of them being introduced through Syria alone, until we cut that down to well under 5 by the end of the 18-month period that marked the additional forces of the surge, during which, by the way, we drove violence down by nearly 90%. Every single metric, whether it was civilians lost, which is a really critical one, sensational attacks, car and suicide vest bombs, our casualties, Iraqi casualties, all of this, very, very dramatically driven down by clear hold and build operations.
Okay. I wish that others would be so patient in their judgment of Israel's morality as you are, because
well, what's interesting is that you have some on one side just say it's never been a more careful campaign, which I think is a bit at least premature. And then others that say there's never been a more destructive campaign, which I think is also a bit premature. Yes, there's been substantial loss of innocent life, without question. And that is troubling. It has to be. I agree with the President and Secretary of State when they have observed that. But again, I can't make a sweeping assessment of this without knowing how it took place. Again, what the assumptions were, what the expectations were, how much was the willingness to take this risk versus how important was that the imperative of destroying or damaging that target. This is, by the way, that innocent civilians were killed in the strike that killed Hassan Nasrallah and destroyed his entire underground headquarters. That should be laid at the feet of Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah, which also for a year has been terrorizing innocent civilians in northern Israel on a daily basis and preventing 65,000 of them at least from going home. So again, sorry to interrupt there, but this is a bit more complex, I think, than people realize sometimes.
Yes. Oh, I would agree. Okay. Well, you mentioned Hezbollah, so I know your time is limited. So it would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this. So, okay. They haven't admitted it and Israel hasn't taken responsibility, but it's believed that the Mossad carried out this pager and communication device operation that destroyed the Hezbollah. Having been the director of the CIA, tell us how impressive was that operation and sophisticated, and what would be involved in carrying out such an operation?
Yeah, I'm not going to go into too many details here. I'll just say this is an extraordinary achievement. Obviously, a supply chain operation, as it's described. Look, when I was 4-star and then CIA director, there were a number of these that were carried out that were somewhat discreet and so forth. Sometimes this is how you killed, say, the most dangerous man in the world or some of these other individuals. This is on a scale and at a level of sophistication and creativity, diabolical inventiveness, initiative that is just unprecedented. I don't know, the Trojan horse was a pretty extraordinary, I don't know if you call it a supply chain operation or what have you, but this is that, on steroids and then many times more. And I don't know if you notice, there are even some aspects that are now, at least this is all in the press, of course. None of this comes from old comrades, but the message that was sent was encrypted. So they actually had to take both hands to decrypt it, which meant that it's in the hands when it blows up. So the damage, again, to the senior leaders, and largely this is influential individuals to get that page. I'm sure the pager was probably a badge of importance and fought over. And so the damage done, as I said earlier, it's far more than decapitation. This is death of the leadership ranks. And then, of course, it was followed up the next day with the walkie-talkies, the next resort, blowing up as well. So I can't think of an operation that is remotely comparable to this, nor to the then subsequent attacks on probably now well over 4,000 different discrete sites that Israel has painstakingly mapped and weaponeered and mensurated grids, as they're called, all of this stuff to do enormous damage to Hezbollah. The problem is that Hezbollah is a very large organization still. It is probably still the most powerful non-state militia, military, whatever you want to describe it as. And it still has a lot of infrastructure, still has probably well over 100,000 rockets, missiles, drones, and other projectiles that it can throw at Israel. It just can't coordinate it because their entire command, control, and communications capability has been dramatically degraded. The problem is they will prove, I fear, resilient. I'd love to see the Lebanese armed forces come in and take control of southern Lebanon, get rid of Hezbollah from the parliament, all of these actions, take back Lebanon. I'm afraid I just don't see that happening. And again, keep in mind, I was the Central Command commander, so spent some quality time in there on the ground with those officials and military leaders, and then also director of the CIA subsequent to that some years later. So this is going to be a tough campaign from here on, as the Israeli Defense Forces now have 3 divisions called up to try to clear as much as they can of the Hezbollah forces and infrastructure and capabilities in the area between the northern border and the Litani River, because that's the area from which you can range with the most ubiquitous of the rockets and even, again, anti-tank guided missiles in an indirect fire mode into northern Israel. But I fear that rockets and missiles are going to continue to land in Israel, and the range can go all the way, certainly well down to Tel Aviv, although there's been a bit of a focus on Haifa and some others, trying to overwhelm the sophisticated layered air and ballistic missile defense. But thankfully, because the command and control and communication systems is largely destroyed, they can't seem to coordinate that in the way that many of us had feared, including in us, the Israeli Defense Forces, I'm sure.
Right. Well, I'm cognizant of your time, and I promise I keep this at 45 minutes. So thank you so much.
Great to be with you.
Thank you for your service. Thank you for your leadership. I only wish Israel could produce leaders like you to run the country. We'd probably be in a better situation than we are now. So thank you so much.
Noah. Thanks very much.
All right. Be well. Take care.
Too.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode. You can find us every Monday and Thursday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and of course, the website of Times of Israel. We wish everyone who is observing a Tzom Kal